Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to OpenView's webinar series. My name is Casey Renner, and I'm the Community Manager here at OpenView. For those of you who might not know, OpenView is a venture capital firm based in Boston, and we focus on expansion stage software companies and then helping them acquire, retain, and grow the right customers and talent. And of course, you can find out more on our site, openviewpartners.com. Today's event will be a discussion around pricing and packaging, moderated by Kyle Poyar, who is a market strategist here at OpenView. Participating in the panel, we have Patrick Campbell, who's the CEO of Price Intelligently, Stephen Forth, who is a pricing consultant, and Monica Saha, who is VP of Marketing at Zora. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over. There will be time for Q&A at the end. As questions come up, please use the chat feature on the left side of your screen, and we'll certainly try to get to as many as possible. And we will be sending out the deck and recording at the end, so please keep an eye out for that. And with that being said, Kyle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm looking forward to a great discussion, hopefully lively, maybe not as lively as last night. The focus of the webinar, as you guys know, is perfecting your SaaS products packaging and pricing, and we're going to deep dive into three different topic areas. One being, what is a value metric and why is it so important for your pricing? The second is how your pricing and packaging strategy should evolve as your company matures. And then third, just how to start the pricing journey and who should own it. So let's kick things off with value metrics. And I have a first question for Patrick on the panel. Patrick, can you tell us about what different components go into pricing and the role that the value metric plays in a company's pricing?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for having me here. So in terms of pricing, I think a lot of people think about pricing just as like the single number on the page, whether it's $50 per month, $100 one-time purchase, but in actuality, pricing gets into a lot of different aspects in terms of packaging, positioning, and of course that number on the page. And then there's a lot of other fun subtopics like discounting, freemium, and all kinds of other things that kind of go into that ultimate alignment of positioning and packaging and pricing. And in particular, looking at value metrics, this is a really, really important piece of a lot of folks' pricing strategies, especially if you're a software company. And just to define it really quickly, a value metric is essentially what you charge for. So if you're Salesforce.com, their value metric is per user. If you're Optimizely, it might be per number of views or per number of visits. But overall, what essentially the importance comes out of the value metric is because it allows you to bake into your value and pricing model essentially expansionary revenue. So you'll have some folks that are not using a ton of the product, paying a lot less than folks who are using an astronomical amount of your particular product, and that allows you to make sure that you're capturing value and you don't have something like a startup paying the same amount as maybe the BBC or the Disney Channel, particularly if there's that differentiated value that there is there.
Got it. And Patrick, I know you've written a lot about this topic and actually some pieces about stopping per user pricing and why especially SaaS companies should be considering other pricing models. What should go into that decision? What factors should a company consider when they're evaluating different metrics?
Yeah, definitely. So the reason, and I know Stephen on the panel here has a lot of opinions and a lot of writings on this as well, but the reason per user pricing, first the reason that per user pricing exists is because it's kind of like a legacy of the old license model for perpetual seats that was sold when we had hard software essentially that you had to pass or basically give out on either hard disks or actually transfers, and that's why it still exists. But the problem with most per-user pricing is that if you're not a sales product, a support product, or even a live chat type product, the experience for anyone that logs into whatever the product might be is actually pretty similar. And the actual value that's being given in that particular product isn't on a per-user basis. So if you think of like a marketing analytics product or a survey tool or a lot of different types of products out there, if you can get the exact same experience no matter what login you use, it's a good kind of litmus test for you probably shouldn't be using per user pricing mainly because there's value in either the amount of money you're saving someone, the amount of visits that are coming to that site, the number of videos that are in their account, et cetera. And I think as we continue to kind of evolve pricing strategies and as technology evolves, that allows us, using products like Zora, for instance, to do more complicated pricing models within our businesses, I think you're going to see a huge push towards more, let's say, complicated, at least internally, not necessarily to the user, value metrics, because we can truly start to charge on the actual value that we're starting to give to our customers overall.
Got it. And Monica, I know you've thought a lot about this topic at Zuora, and per Patrick's comment, Zuora actually enables a lot of creativity with pricing and value metrics. How have you guys approached it at Zuora, and how do you think about this?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kyle. So at Zuora, when we started off about 8 years ago, it's interesting that we're on the topic of value metric because at the time and even today for a certain core section of our product, we chose to price based on transaction volume. So part of the Zuora, that's part of the value that Zuora provides, in addition to helping customers enable different pricing models, we also help automate the process for billing for those pricing models. And so from a very early on, part of our strategy was to charge based on the transaction volume going through the system. And at the time, we got a lot of pushback from our install or from the target market that we were going after, because buyers in those markets were used to paying for, let's say, accounting software on a per user basis, or used to paying for CRM software on a per user basis, or used to paying for some other billing software on a per user basis. And so we learned early on that we not only have, when we come up with this value metric, we also have to be very, very cautious about training the folks that are selling our product to articulate it the right way. Because if you think about it, if we had gone down the model of doing a per user pricing model, which we certainly could have, then if you think about the value that Zuora was providing, it wasn't that you need a lot of people to log into our system and do a whole bunch of things. At the end of the day, the core value from a market positioning standpoint was how much of this go-to-market process can we automate for you. And so if the compelling value was automation, easy billing automation for some very complex pricing models, then we wanted to base it on the more we can automate, the more value that we're providing, and therefore it was tied to transaction volume. But it took a while for the market to really understand that and grasp that, and it took us a very deliberate effort on our part to help our team articulate it in the right way. And also when we talk to customers, for example, I'll give you another example of a customer that provided server monitoring software. And so they were using Zuora to set up their pricing, and they were having a conversation with us around, we have this per user model so that different users within the IT organization can get access to the different monitoring tools that we have for the different servers. And so, we like the per user thing, but we're also thinking about having a per alert, the number of alerts that we send out and things like that. But if you think about it, if they're doing a really good job because later on their application got smarter, they could predict issues before they were happening. You actually are doing a good job if you're sending out less alerts. So maybe the per alert model isn't great, but the one thing that they did get asked for a lot is when an alert did go out, or if something did go wrong, then the depth of the report that they would provide later on, the root cause analysis report, how deep should you go? And so maybe there's value in charging more for a much more deeper root cause analysis report versus something that's just a standard report that you give, where it's an easy report and you don't have to spend a ton of resources to gather that. So that's sort of our thinking behind the value metric, and it's different for every company, but it's very much aligned to, at the end of the day, what are you helping the customer solve?
Got it. And I guess following up on your experience, I know you said the market has started to catch up with Zuora over time, and you've honed the way you talk about pricing and the value metrics. What changes have you seen in the market in terms of pricing models and value metrics that are out there?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we are seeing a lot more acceptance and openness to, at least for our space, having a consumption-based or transaction-based variable pricing model, because the other side of it is that if the customer's sales are declining, or they're not able to sell as much as they wanted to, or bill for as much as they wanted to, we don't see as much transaction volume going through our system, and so we make less money as well. So our incentives are very, very closely aligned. And so over time, that has gotten a lot easier for us to explain, and we are seeing other vendors in our space move to that model as well and price similarly. And so that over time has definitely evolved and helped the conversation.
Got it. And then, Stephen, I did want to turn to you. I know you are a serial entrepreneur and an advisor for many companies. What trends have you been seeing in terms of how companies think about value metrics and use it in their pricing?
Yeah, so I just want to quickly mention that Monica is absolutely right. In order to make a successful transition towards value-based pricing, you do have to make sure that your sales force and your marketing is focused on being able to communicate value and to sell on value. But I've seen a few very interesting transitions over the last year. One company that I help coach is a two-sided market company that's involved in scheduling the workers who work on large events, on major events like South by Southwest. And originally they do this using SMS text messages, because that's what a lot of these younger workers use to communicate. And they were originally charging based on the number of messages sent. But they recently switched from the number of messages sent to the number of positions filled. Because if you think about it, the event companies, they don't actually want to be sending lots of messages. They want to be filling positions with as few messages as possible. And this shift from messages sent to positions filled has actually allowed this company to increase its revenues by 70 or 80% month to month. So it's had a huge impact. Wow. I'm sure many of the people on this webinar remember or know Aaron Ross and the predictive revenue approach to selling that came out of Salesforce. Aaron is involved in a very interesting software company. I'm tempted to call them lead gen, but they would probably object to that characterization. But what they do is they use the predictive revenue methodology to help mostly B2B SaaS companies get calls booked with the people that they're targeting. And again, they've recently shifted their pricing metric to rather than leads generated, to calls booked, because calls booked is what they're paying for. But I think where this is going to get incredibly exciting is with the Internet of Things, because the reason that the B2B SaaS and the cloud companies have been leading this is because cloud companies are able to gather and analyze huge amounts of data about what their users are doing and what their users are doing to generate value. And that's why companies like Zuora have been at the front of this charge. But with the Internet of Things, we will have all sorts of companies being able to gather the usage data and compile data that allows us to deeply understand how we're delivering value and then shift our pricing that way. And I'm going to give a really interesting example. So there's a precision agriculture company called Semios that is starting to dominate in the almond space in California. And they gather a huge amount of data about moisture, pests, temperature at a very micro level. Now, currently, they are charging per acre. They charge a flat fee per acre. But what they are doing is they are gathering the underlying baseline data so that in the near future, well, near future in this case probably being 3 years from now, but in agriculture that's relatively quick, they will actually start charging by the impact they have on yield. So their impact on yield per acre, and they'll charge also on the grade of the agricultural produce per acre. So switching from a straight per acre price to how they actually impact the value of the produce generated per acre. And I think we're going to see this all across the Internet of Things. Everywhere that the Internet of Things touches, especially on the industrial side, we will see far more use of these dynamic value-based pricing models. And I suspect that in a decade, Zuora will have more customers in manufacturing than it does in B2B SaaS.
Got it. Great. And I guess I want to move on to the next topic, but it's just a quick housekeeping item for those dialing in. If you have additional questions on this topic or other topics, feel free to write it in the chat, and we'll get those asked as well. So, we've been talking a bit about packaging and pricing evolution and, Zuora's evolution specifically, as well as other companies that Stephen mentioned. Stephen, I know you've given a lot of thought to how pricing and packaging evolves, or it should evolve, with the technology adoption cycle. And could you talk through your experience and what you've learned?
Yeah, so I'll just preface this by saying that there's two modes of thought about pricing and early-stage innovation. One is that you worry about pricing once you've got product market fit. And the other is that pricing is core to the product, and understanding and building in value and building in the ability to track the data that monitors that value is at the center of the product. And you can guess which side of that I fall on. I think that we need to start thinking about pricing and value right from the very beginning of product development and product design. Now, having said that, there's some very interesting things that we experience as we go across the product adoption lifecycle. I'm sure that most, if not all, of the people on this call, on this webinar, have burned into their brains the Moore technology adoption lifecycle, where you have the innovators, then the early adopters, then the bowling pin, then the tornado, then Main Street, and then the laggards. And one of the things that we've discovered working with a lot of companies taking early-stage innovation to market is that the response to price is very different depending on what stage you're in. So I'll just give an example from my own experience. I was the co-founder of a company called Leverage Point in the Boston area that actually does a B2B SaaS value-based pricing platform. And we worked with a gentleman, Tom Nagel, who's the author of the Strategy and Tactics of Pricing on this. Now, when we first went to market, we went and talked to all the people that we thought were really smart about pricing, to people at Simon Kucher Partners, to people at Deloitte and McKinsey, and our peers. And everyone said, that is a fantastic idea. It's brilliant. We just love it. And that was validation, we thought. We were sort of young and naive at the time. And we went out and we built our first version, and we said, great, here it is. What do you think? And they said, that's great. That's exactly what you should be doing. And say, okay, so now how much will you pay? We'd like to charge you for using this. And just a moment. We're the innovators here, and we're not going to pay anything to use your software. And so, oh my God, we're in deep trouble. Then we were fortunate enough to find an early adopter client who was willing to pay in the mid to high six figures for it. We thought, wow, this is fantastic. But you have to understand about what early adopters is. Early adopters are buying in order to get a competitive advantage that nobody else has, and they're willing to pay a lot of money for that competitive advantage. They are not a pricing reference for the rest of the market. So then as we moved over into the Geoffrey Moore's bowling alley, and we started to target primarily industrial chemical companies, we found that the reality was that the actual value that the actual price that we could extract from the value that we were generating was only about 20 or 30% of what the early adopters were willing to pay. And now having studied this across 25 or 30 companies, this is a pretty typical experience, that the very early innovators are generally, they're willing to use your crappy alpha software. They're willing to give you lots of good advice. They're willing to recommend it to people, but they're not really willing to pay. Then you can find your champion, your early adopter champion, and they're willing to pay a lot of money because they share your vision, and they are willing to help you build that vision, and they want a leg up over their competitors. So they are often willing to pay an order of magnitude more than where your pricing is actually going to settle once you get into the market. And then there's also important transitions in how you think about value and pricing as you move from the bowling alley into the tornado. In the bowling alley, you are generally looking at very industry-specific, very precise value drivers that are used to generate the value for your software or whatever it is that you're selling. It doesn't have to be software. And as you move over into the tornado, the value drivers that matter and that your marketing and your sales and your pricing need to be focused on are cross-cutting ones, the most general value drivers possible. So there's a really interesting evolution of how you think about and communicate pricing as you move across the Moore technology adoption cycle.
Got it. And then I want to turn to Patrick, and then I had a question for you, and then wanted to move to one of the questions from the audience. So, and this actually corresponds to something that I might have written in the comments. When should a company start worrying about pricing? Is it only important once you get big, or should early stage companies be really thinking about it as well? And how does that play a role?
Yeah, I think, this is Patrick jumping in, I think that it's tough because ideally, and I agree with Steve on this, that it should be a core competency within your business. And the reason is because if you think about your actual price point, especially if you're a subscription company, everything that you're doing is either driving someone, a customer or prospect, to a purchasing decision or justifying the package or the price that you've put in front of them. It's something that's that important. We always say that the price is basically the exchange rate on the value that you've created. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you have some sort of semi-constant measurement of, what the willingness to pay, what folks want in terms of features, what they don't want in terms of features. And so what we recommend doing, and we work with tons and tons of software companies at this point, is really to have someone in your org that has 20% of their time, so maybe a day a week, basically dedicated to this problem, and having some sort of a pricing committee, even if you're just 4 people early on, because what that means is you're not going to become one of these companies that gets 5 years down the road and has never really looked at their pricing, and then all of a sudden is wondering what's wrong in terms of how they're going to be able to grow to that next level, and ultimately can't change the minds of a company at that point because there's so much kind of momentum going into one direction rather than having pricing being a core competency. And so realistically, though, I think that when you're early on, you should spend a little bit of time, meaning maybe the equivalent of about 12 to 15 hours doing some customer development and research related to pricing, and then kind of put it on a shelf for 6 months and then revisit it at least every 6 months. And then once you get to a certain size, and we've seen it around 5 million ARR or higher, that's when you really should start having someone dedicated at least 20% of their time, if not more. And then if you're over, if you start to get into the mid-market or the enterprise, you should realistically really have someone 100% dedicated to pricing, packaging, and positioning, mainly because it really comes back to those personas. And the beauty of the subscription model and the beauty of software just in general is that it's a nice, beautiful, simple, and very compounding formula of just acquiring customers, monetizing them appropriately, and then retaining them into the long term. So if you don't have someone that's measuring this pulse of where those users are in terms of price, packaging, et cetera, you're going to end up missing out on a lot of deltas. And I guess to put it one other way, if your packaging or your actual product is improving, then your price should be improving. And that's why you want to make sure that you have that constant momentum on measuring price and really improving price.
Definitely. And I think it's a related question that I'd love to get Monica's take here. The question from Jason: is it fair to assume a value-based pricing model is more relevant to a growth stage SaaS company that has the data to determine the value, where maybe a user-based model is more common in the early stages, where a company is working to develop stickiness and understand usage? What's your take there?
I think that at least my perspective is I don't think it's limited to early stage or late stage. I think that if you can decide on and align on what is that value that you're going to be providing to your market ahead of time, then ultimately, even when you're starting off, you'll be able to explain that to your target customers and your target market. And if you design a certain pricing model that they're not used to, the early stages are a fantastic time to actually test the positioning of that versus, starting simple and starting with something that everyone is used to, the per user model, till you have enough data to do the value-based models. So I actually think, aligning on what that value metric is sort of that fundamental, existential question that you want to be asking in the very beginning, because that should not just drive your product roadmap as to what features you're going to build and all of that stuff, but it will ultimately also inform your pricing. And one thing I think that everybody on this call will hopefully agree with, and the audience should feel comfortable about, is that you probably won't get it right the first time. And so it's okay to experiment, and you should always be constantly be open to revising and being able to explain to your market and within the organization, explaining what it is that you are trying to achieve and what it is that you're trying to test. And that's a lot of what our customers do with Zuora as well, is when they're initially launching something, they're using Zuora not just to enable pricing, but also using it as sort of a fast way to experiment with different models and see which one works.
Yeah, I'd like to sorry, Kyle.
Oh, go ahead. Stephen, actually, when you respond to that, I'd also love to get your take as well on triggers that a company should look out for to signal that they're due for a pricing change. Patrick talked about whenever the value is increased. Mm-hmm. Monica spoke to that. Would be very curious about your perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. So I just want to, again, reinforce what Monica said. This idea that it is okay to start with per user or some sort of ad hoc pricing model and then move to value-based pricing once you're larger is precisely wrong. That is absolutely the wrong way to approach it. You have to begin by understanding how you are going to be creating value by instrumenting your software so that it is collecting the relevant data, and then by weaving that in. And as Monica said, at the beginning is the time where you can really set this in users' minds and in buyers' minds. Once your pricing model and your price is established, it is extremely difficult and expensive to change it. And the beginning is the best time to direction set. Once you are in the market, the kinds of triggers that you should be looking for to suggest it's time to rethink your your pricing model, I think there are a number of them. But one is you should be constantly testing your value propositions against your own internal models and with your customers to see and make sure that you actually are delivering the value. And it's sometimes the case that because of changes in market conditions or changes in the competitive environment, the value that you are creating actually is reduced. And when that's the case, you may need to go in and adjust your pricing to reflect the lower value that you're now delivering. We see this a lot, especially in fintech and in financial markets, where in many cases the value created is based on the value of a customer or the value of a transaction, and that can be very sensitive to interest rates and other external variables. So you need to understand what external market variables and competitor actions are going to impact your value, and you need to be able to respond to that. Another critical thing is most of us will have, 3-tier, possibly more architectures. Look at your pricing architecture and make sure that each of your pricing tiers is actually playing the role that you intend. We were looking at or working with a company in the content management space about 9 months ago, and it was all of its sales were going into its top tier. Well, 90% of the revenue was being generated by the top tier, and the less expensive tiers, let's say the bronze and silver tier, were not playing the function intended by them in the initial design. So you should always be tracking the flow through the different tiers of your pricing architecture to make sure that each tier is actually fulfilling the goal desired. For many companies, you would expect about, it's hard to generalize here, but just as a vague generalization, 20 to 30% of your revenue will be coming from your top tiers, maybe as much as 50%. Another large chunk of revenue will be coming from your middle tier, and your intro tier is primarily being used to feed the other tiers. That's one model. There are others. But in any case, whatever model that you're using, you have to be monitoring it to make sure it's actually behaving the way that it's intended. And you will, if it's not, and I would say that if you have not checked this within the last 3 months, your model is probably not working the way you intended. You'll have to adjust some aspect of pricing. That's not necessarily the dollar figure of price. As Patrick was saying, price is more complex than that. It's your defenses that you use to channel customers into different offers. It's your pricing metric. It's your communication strategy. Those are all things that you need to balance. But test to make sure that your models are actually behaving the way that your business plan says they will. And if they're not, understand why not and what changes you may need to make.
And Patrick, I know you've thought a lot about this topic. I'd love to get your take on triggers as well, and then move to the next topic area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of in line with what Steve was talking about, or Stephen was talking about. So we've seen, we did actually a study, and it's hard to talk about it without displaying it, but it's just really relevant. So I wanted to bring it up. Where looking at your main subscription metrics in kind of the acquisition pillar of your business, the monetization pillar, and the retention pillar of your business, and really making sure that you have balanced growth. So we saw about 1,200 SaaS companies in the study that we did, that the companies that had strictly acquisition-based growth, meaning all they were doing is increasing the number of net new leads, increasing conversion rate, but had stagnation in ARPA as well as in their gross churn. Those companies were growing at a much, much less heavy rate, or they were actually dying out much, much quicker than those companies that had very balanced growth across increasing net new leads and conversion rate, increasing ARPA, and also increasing or decreasing churn in this case. And so what we normally see as a really, really good litmus of when pricing is a problem is that if you look at the past 4 quarters, if you're a more established company, and you can actually see improvements in basically acquisition, but stagnation in both of your monetization and retention metrics, it's normally an indication that you're brute forcing your growth a little bit too much, and you're not, one, keeping your customers around long enough, but also that you have some stagnation around price, or packaging, depending on if you're trying to increase that ARPA. Because Steve's absolutely right in terms of the proportion of plans, depending if you have 2 plans, 3 plans, 5 plans, or a more complicated rate card. The proportions are going to be very, very different. But ultimately, depending on the industry or the vertical that you're in, but ultimately you want to make sure that that ARPA is increasing at a nice steady rate over the trajectory of your company. And if it's not, it's a really good indication that you have a lot of stagnant pricing. And you probably already know without looking at ARPA if you're getting customer complaints about pricing or customer confusion, or if your board is yelling at you that you have to fix price. But if you need a more quantitative look, those are the 3 metrics that I'd start to look at and start to compare.
Great. Then I want to move into the next topic and then make sure we have time to go through more audience questions. So the next topic is around starting the pricing journey, and so actually a number of questions have been around, I have a pricing model a certain way, might want to change it, I'm not actually sure where to start or how to do it. Patrick, how do you help your clients think about how to start their pricing journey and rethink how they approach pricing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for us, it always comes back to the persona or personas that you're targeting. What's really interesting is, we've, at this point, to put out some other data, we've looked at, we did a survey of, I think it was about 1,600 founders and C-levels at different SaaS companies, and actually found that most companies, they don't have any concept of what's called a buyer persona internally, or if they do, it's like very fluffy with like, a cute avatar and a cute name like Startup Steve or, Mid-Marketer Mary. And what's interesting is, that's kind of the start, the kernel of starting your pricing, journey. But what we want to start to do is actually quantify those personas on a deeper level. So normally what we recommend is if you're starting from scratch, get into a room basically with, some folks who have been around the company for a while, or some different members of, marketing, product, finance, sales, and basically get down a draft of who you think those buyers are, and then go well beyond some of the psychographics that you think those buyers are, meaning what features are really driving them to purchase or upgrade, what features do they not care about at all, put some estimates down on where you think the willingness to pay for that particular user is, and then even get your unit economics for those particular personas, your CAC, your LTV, et cetera. And then the next step is to just get out of the room and start to go to the customer. And there's some different open source models that you can use to collect data from your customers and basically create more of a quantified buyer persona that we talk about. And the reason that this is so important is because when you get to your pricing page and you're starting to put together whatever that packaging and that price looks like, you want to make sure that you're aligning it to those particular buyers, and you're ultimately quantifying how a user is going to have an upgrade path and also an entry path into your product. And if you don't know who that buyer is, then there's really no way in hell you're going to know like what to put on that particular page or how to structure it. And unfortunately, most of us don't have truly enough traffic to multivariate test our way to pricing success, and that's why you have to go out to your buyers and quantify and collect data from them in particular. And as Monica and Stephen were talking about, it's not necessarily going to be complete or perfect the first time you do it, but that's why if you get a process moving where you're collecting this data every quarter, every 6 months, over time you'll have this really, really rich tableau of information about each of these personas. That's not only going to help your pricing, but it's actually going to help your marketing team, your product team, your sales team do with some of the other things that were said today, not only sell the right thing to the right person, but make sure that that entire experience for that customer is optimized around, bringing them through the door as soon as possible, making enough money off of them, and then retaining them over time.
Got it. And I think what's interesting with the pricing journey from my perspective is there's the process of sort of doing a pricing project and gathering the foundation and the insights and really understanding the buyers, all the sort of research that goes into it. And then there's the people side and, figuring out who in the organization does it, how much time do they devote to it, does it fall in product, marketing, finance. I'm really curious, Monica, to get your take about how you approach this at Zuora and maybe from other companies you've worked with. And how did you decide who owns the pricing journey, and how has that maybe changed over time?
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of how we do it at Zuora, we've gone through different iterations of this, and we learned some lessons as we went, and I'll share some of that now, which is in the early days of the company, pricing and packaging was very much a, kind of owned by the head of product and our head of sales, and finance was sort of on the tertiary, like they were on the sidelines. It was very much product and sales driven, and then finance, they would literally tell the finance team, hey, here's how we're going to price this. And then we went through that for a year or so, a year and a half, and then we like, okay, that's not quite working. So we switched to another model where, okay, the finance team and the sales organization was in the primary driver's seat, and the product organization was sort of a key stakeholder, but not necessarily in driver's seat. And you're like, okay, well, that didn't quite work either, or did not achieve the types of alignment that we needed on the people side. And so the way that we're running it now, which is at least for the last couple of years, and this has been working quite well, which is it is very much a tight collaboration between the product team, so specifically product marketing and finance, and specifically within finance, it's finance operations. And so finance operations and product marketing very much driving the strategy, driving where we want to go, and the sales organization and our customer success organization, who are both jointly care about acquisition as well as retention, are our key stakeholders. Those are the folks that we work with to get input, to get validation, to collect data, to share our findings. And so that model is working well for us at the moment. And the reason why it's very helpful to partner, for the product organization to partner with the finance organization, is as we develop our product, and we are on a very, very rapid innovation cycle, we're releasing new capabilities literally on a monthly basis. It is very it's integral, and it's very good for us to have finance be right there with us, and they will think about things in a way that maybe we aren't thinking about from an operations standpoint. And then we also have input from them on how to incentivize the right behavior within our own company. So if you're in the audience and you have a B2B sales model, you've got salespeople, so it's not just how do you price and package something, but then in order to achieve the results that you want to achieve with the packaging, how do you incentivize the right behavior from your sales organization to get to the right place? Because the thing that we talk about a lot at Zuora is creating what we call growth journeys with our packaging. How do you get somebody started on a certain package and then grow over time? And in order for a customer to enter that growth journey in the right spot, your sales organization, your customer success organization has to understand their needs, point them towards the right entry point, and maybe the customer self-selects into the right entry point, but then how do we then grow that over time? So creating those growth journeys becomes very, very important, and having that finance perspective along with the product perspective and having customer success and sales as our key stakeholders is a model that's been working well.
Great. And I think it's interesting with Zuora how you have kind of an interesting case where the buyer is maybe a financial buyer, and so the finance team can both kind of be keep the eyes on profitability and revenue, but then also have the perspective of someone that would actually be buying something like this in the market, which is great.
Exactly.
And then, also curious, so, you've certainly evolved pricing over time, and I guess I'm curious if this is maybe for you, Monica, and then also for others on the line. When would it make sense to hire a team or an individual to own packaging and pricing, or or do you think it should? Is there a point when that makes sense, or types of companies where that makes sense, or should it always kind of be split across different functions?
Yeah. So this is.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Monica.
So we at Zuora, at least, we have, it is currently jointly owned by product marketing and finance. There isn't one person that owns it, and it was a deliberate choice for us at the moment because we do feel that if you could have somebody own it and it be their full-time job, but without that crucial input of being close to the product, close to the field, and close to just our overall operating model, our financial operating model, those inputs are really, really important. So that's why we currently don't have a single one-person owner, but we have two very specific owners across two very different functions that are then responsible for aligning everybody and getting all the right data and doing all the different studies and all those kinds of things.
And Stephen, what were you going to add to that?
Yeah. So I think that for early stage companies, I actually think that the evolution that was described for Zora is actually a fairly common one. And it wasn't that they didn't get it right at the beginning. I think actually in many ways they did get it right, but it needs to evolve at each phase of the company's evolution. So at the very early stages of the company, pricing has to be part of product. It cannot be anything part of any other part of the company. However, you need to work very closely with finance to make sure that on two things. One is to make sure that your pricing models and your financial planning and your pro formas actually connect with each other. And secondly, many product people don't have the numeracy or the skill set that's needed to do some of the math around good pricing. So finance can bring those critical skills into the product, and by doing that, you start building the relationships that you're going to need over time. I actually think that pricing is, in most cases, much more of a consultative role than it is a prescriptive role, especially for value-driven companies. And you don't really need a full-time pricing group until you are large enough to bring that consulting function inside, which is, Zora may be approaching that. We know that Salesforce is past that, but for most companies, your pricing experts are really going to be working with coordinating across product, finance, sales, customer success to pull all of the data and all of the insights together and feed them back and forth between those different groups. And so until you're large enough to need that coordination function, I don't think you need a full-time internal pricing person. You do need to make sure that product, finance, sales, marketing, Marcom, customer success, even some of the operating functions and code, the people doing the code and data analytics, all understand enough about pricing so that they are gathering the right data, analyzing it, creating those messages, and communicating them. I would actually think that very early stage companies, even growth stage companies, would probably want to work with a consultant for the expertise. And then you only really bring that function internal once you've reached a scale where it makes sense to have some of that consulting strength internally. I don't think this is like some of the large transactional driven companies that might have 10,000 SKUs and 50 million transactions and are running a dynamic analytical pricing system against that. If you're one of those companies, then by all means, bring in pricing expertise as early as you can. But if you're not one of those companies, I would say that bringing in that as an individual should be delayed as long as you can.
Okay. And then I did want to turn to some of the audience questions. And I guess the first one I'd want to pivot towards Patrick. There's a question around testing different pricing pages, and the specific question was around how do you test pricing at scale, and thinking about website testing, but then also other forms of testing. We wanted to get your perspective here.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that kind of go back to a little bit of what I was talking about before. Ultimately, I think there's a lot of different factors that go into even a very simple pricing grid. If you look at something that has 3 to 4 differentiable features, and then each of those particular tiers, let's say 3 tiers, has a different price point, you're looking at a lot of different types of tests to make sure that you're setting this up correctly. And so what we recommend, particularly if you don't have the traffic to sustain some multivariate or even A/B testing and truly get some good answers, or even if you're in a situation where you have a very negotiable sale where you're on the phone with someone and you're closing a deal through a DocuSign or some sort of document, we recommend really kind of collecting a good amount of data from those buyer personas, or data that's targeted on a couple of the problems that you're facing, whether it's a value metric that you're trying to figure out, a particular price point you're trying to figure out, or where to put this new particular feature, whether it should be an add-on or whether it should be included in tier 1, 2, or 3, et cetera. And then once you get some of that data back, that'll start to cut down a lot of the decisions in terms of testing. So if you find out that unanimously people want per user pricing, or people are value is really ascribed to the number of visits that they get on your platform, then all of a sudden that's something that you don't necessarily have to test, and you can kind of bake that into the product. And long story short, all of a sudden what that ends up doing is it takes this problem from something that is, a huge black box that you don't even want to touch because, you've never done a lot around pricing before, and it starts to make it in very, very chunkable pieces that you can find solutions to and then ultimately put things forward. The one thing that I will say about testing on pricing pages is that there aren't enough tests out there around, should you end your prices in 9s or 5s? Should you put the highest tier on the left or the right? Like all of those different things that you might read about in some sort of growth hacky blog post, or we all like to retweet because they're interesting, those are so dependent on what's going on with your particular buyer and your particular product, that oftentimes those tactics, they're basically as useful as the entertainment you get out of a blog post. And so we always recommend really focusing on those particular buyers. And once you've solved kind of a lot of that pricing problem and put stuff forward, that's when you can start to do, hey, let's experiment with putting, this part of the page here and that part of the page there, because those are those last 5% of optimizations that are going to give you the rest of the lift, rather than the actual research that's going to give you the core of your pricing strategy.
Got it.
I also have one more comment to add to that, if that's okay, Kyle.
Certainly.
Around testing. This is something that we've been doing for the last, I would say, about 3 years or so, is especially for SaaS companies, this might be helpful if you're in B2B SaaS. If there's a big release that you're doing for a brand new area of the product, and you're planning to price it in a certain way, or you have certain, maybe you have 2 or 3 options you want to test. One of the things that you might try is have a limited availability period for that product before it goes GA. And the idea is that the limited availability, during that phase, it's not that the product is half-baked. It's not that you're selling anything that's in beta. The product is fully ready, but maybe you make it available only to a certain number of customers, and you choose your sample size. Maybe it's 50, maybe it's 100. And you have your organization test out, you could have certain segments of your organization propose X pricing framework and another segment propose Y pricing framework. And you can use those opportunities to test both frameworks, and you can be transparent with the prospects to say, during this limited availability period, we're making this product available at a lower price point. That becomes a promotion for them, a catalyst for them to sign in, assuming they see the value in it. But it also gives you the ability to test your positioning for that pricing in a very real scenario versus a theoretical scenario. And we found that we've learned a lot through that process. Our prospects appreciate it. The sales organization appreciates it as well, because they get to, they feel part of the process. They get to pitch this, position it, and understand how it's going to land in very real situations. Great.
And there are a lot of other audience questions that I'm going to need to wrap up discussion, just to be mindful of time. I think before there was one question around resources to recommend, and I'll do a quick plug for that one. Zuora has an academy that has lots of really great pricing resources that they've taken time to build out. Price Intelligently, the blog, and many of the guides are the best, some of the best in the space. And then selfishly, OpenView has got a lot of great content out there as well. So there's a lot of resources from people on this call that you can turn to for more questions. And then also, Casey is going to be following up with all the participants with a recording and additional details. And you can reach out to Casey to kind of follow up and get put in touch with the right person if you want to talk about your specific situation and specific pricing challenges.
Yeah, so thank you everyone so much for joining. All of our panelists, thank you so much. We've got some really great questions to get answered for the audience. So as Kyle just mentioned, I did keep track of all the questions that were asked. So if we didn't get to you, I will go through and sort of circulate who would be the best person to get that answered and get that back to you. All of you have my email, crenner@openviewpartners.com. Please feel free to reach out. Kyle didn't mention this, but we, in terms of the content we do have sort of the ultimate SaaS pricing guide, which Kyle put together. So please go to our website and sign up for that. And in addition to that, on this Friday at 2 Eastern, Kyle will be participating in Disrupt TV and actually talking about the pricing guide and a few takeaways from that. So if you are interested in attending, just please email me for details or go to disrupttv.com. And for all of you, if there's anyone interested in sort of the sales tech stack, our next upcoming webinar is on the evolution of that next Wednesday. So please feel free to join us. And thank you all again for attending today.